So you're sitting in a virtual meeting. You've got colleagues dialing in from Tokyo, from Berlin, maybe New York.
Right, the classic global sync.
Exactly. And you spend, I don't know, an hour going over this incredibly critical project plan. Everyone on the screen is nodding.
Lots of thumbs up in the chat.
Yeah, everyone says yes or gives that thumbs up. And you log off completely, 100% certain that the entire team is aligned.
You feel great about it.
You really do. But then, a week later, the deliverables come back, and they are entirely different from what you expected.
Oh, completely off script.
Right. Nobody actually agreed to the plan, the timeline is totally shot, and everyone involved is just quietly furious with each other.
It's the ultimate illusion of alignment, you know?
Yes. You thought you had a consensus, but what you actually had was a massive cultural collision.
Because you mistake that absence of immediate vocal conflict for actual agreement.
Right, which is just a wild assumption to make.
It is. Because you're completely unaware that half the people in that digital room operate on a communication framework where, well, saying no directly is considered a catastrophic professional failure.
And that specific disconnect, that illusion, is exactly the mission for today's deep dive.
It's such a crucial topic.
It really is. We are deconstructing the psychological underpinnings of global communication. We're moving way past those superficial corporate brochures on cultural diversity.
Oh, you mean the ones that just give you a cheat sheet on how to exchange a business card?
Exactly. Or like how to bow correctly. We are ignoring all of that today. We are exploring the invisible psychological architecture driving how we actually work, how we process conflict, and, how we build trust across borders.
Because the friction in those misaligned meetings, it's almost never about the technical work itself.
It's not about the spreadsheets.
No, it's a clash of deeply ingrained cognitive processes. And
Yeah.
honestly, if you cannot decode those processes, you just cannot lead a modern team.
Totally. So, to map this all out, we have an incredible stack of sources today. We're pulling insights from TEDx Talks by Chris White, Valerie Hooks, and Maria Pastorelli.
Some really fantastic frameworks in those.
Yeah, and we also have corporate culture analyses from Jessica Kriegel, the employment experts at Indeed, and the analytics team at WorkHuman.
The data from WorkHuman is it's staggering.
It really puts things in perspective. Plus, we're grounding the theory with some academic breakdowns from Penn State Extension.
Which is great for the foundational psychology.
Right. And to tie it all together, we have this highly revealing case study. It's this raw, post-mortem dialogue between two global project leaders, Elena from Europe and Kenji from Japan.
That transcript is just a goldmine.
It really is a perfect microcosm of everything going wrong, even when both parties have the absolute best intentions.
I love the Kenji and Elena transcript because it strips away all the academic jargon, you know?
Yeah, it makes it real.
Exactly. It shows us the visceral, exhausting reality of trying to manage a project when the underlying communication governance is just entirely broken.
Okay, so let's unpack this. We need to start at the absolute foundation.
Right, the ground floor.
Yeah. We have to define what is actually happening in the brain when a team of people, all speaking fluent English, fundamentally misunderstand each other.
Well, the Penn State Extension research gives us a really useful starting point here.
Is that the iceberg thing?
Yeah, the concept of the cultural iceberg. Because when organizations try to tackle diversity, they almost exclusively focus on the tip of the iceberg.
The part you can see above the water?
Right, which is only about 10% of the whole thing.
Yeah.
That's the language people speak, the food they eat in the break room, the holiday calendar, the dress code.
Basically, the superficial markers of diversity that you can easily slap onto a company recruitment poster.
Precisely. But the Penn State material emphasizes that the massive, highly dangerous 90% of the iceberg is submerged.
And it's entirely invisible to the naked eye.
Completely invisible. That submerged mass consists of our core beliefs, our attitudes toward authority, concepts of fairness, unspoken norms, and our fundamental vision of how the world ought to work.
So when a global project goes off the rails, it's never because of the visible tip of the iceberg?
Never. It is because those massive, submerged psychological structures violently collided beneath the surface.
Wow. Okay, so to understand what that underwater mass is actually made of, we can look at Jessica Kriegel's psychological model.
Her framework is so helpful for this.
It really is. Kriegel argues that culture is not just a static demographic checkbox. It's not just the country stamped on your passport.
Right, it's much more active than that.
Exactly. She says culture is an active, deeply embedded psychological cycle. And she breaks this down into a specific four-step loop, starting with our experiences,
Because our brains are absorbing millions of data points from the moment we are born.
just constantly taking in data.
Yeah, like how large your family was, the religious tone of your household, the specific rules at your childhood dinner table.
Like whether you were allowed to speak up or not.
Exactly. Were you encouraged to argue with your parents? Or were you expected to remain totally silent while the adults spoke? Those early experiences are the raw material.
And those raw experiences feed directly into the second step of Kriegel's cycle, which is beliefs.
Right, the brain's rule book.
Yeah, a child's brain takes all those dinner table rules and solidifies them into this comprehensive map of the world.
We build internal algorithms for what is safe versus unsafe.
Right, what's polite versus highly offensive, what constitutes respect, and what constitutes a threat.
And once those beliefs are locked in, they dictate the third step, which is actions.
Okay, so the beliefs turn into behavior.
Exactly. The beliefs you formed about authority when you were 8 years old directly inform how you address your vice president in a boardroom when you were 35.
Oh, that's wild to think about.
Right. Your internal map tells you whether it is safer to challenge a bad idea publicly or to quietly agree and try to fix it behind the scenes.
Which naturally leads to the final step in Kriegel's loop, which is results.
The outcomes of all those actions.
Yeah, the compounding effect of those daily actions determines the business outcomes you achieve, the promotions you get, and the culture you ultimately build around yourself.
So it's experiences forge beliefs, beliefs dictate actions, and actions produce results.
It's essentially this invisible operating system running constantly in the background of our brains.
And just like a computer's operating system, you are completely oblivious to it until it crashes.
Right, you don't even know it's there.
You just assume that everyone else on your global Zoom call is running the exact same software, interpreting data through the exact same algorithm.
But I want to challenge the necessity of that operating system, though.
Okay, let's hear it.
I mean, we are talking about highly educated professionals here. If we know that relying on childhood dinner table assumptions leads to business failures, why can't we just override the system?
You'd think we could, right?
Yeah. Why does the human brain rely so heavily on these rigid cultural algorithms instead of just processing the people in front of us objectively, in real time?
Well, it comes down to the brutal reality of metabolic economics.
Metabolic economics.
Yeah, Maria Pastorelli touches on this in her research. The human brain is not a neutral video camera recording objective reality. It is a prediction machine.
A prediction machine. Okay, so it's guessing.
Exactly. Processing entirely new, novel information from scratch requires a massive expenditure of metabolic energy. And the brain is inherently designed to conserve energy whenever possible.
So it constantly looks for cognitive shortcuts so it doesn't overheat, basically.
That's a great way to put it. Pastorelli illustrates this beautifully with a classic linguistic experiment. She puts a slide up in front of an audience featuring a dense paragraph of text.
Oh, I think I've seen this one.
You probably have. The catch is that every single word in the paragraph is jumbled. Only the first and the last letters of each word are in their correct positions.
And all the middle letters are just randomized chaos.
Right, so if you look at any single word in isolation, it is complete gibberish.
But if you speak the language, your brain doesn't look at the words in isolation.
Not at all.
As you scan the paragraph, you can read it fluently, almost at full speed, without pausing to decode the jumbled letters.
Because the brain isn't actually reading every letter. It is predicting the word based on the first letter, the last letter, and the context of the sentence.
It just fills in the blank using the software it already installed years ago.
Exactly. Now, take that mechanism and apply it to a global business environment.
Oh, I see where this is going.
Right, when you log into a meeting with a new vendor from a different continent, processing their unique individual psychology, their specific background, and their subtle verbal cues, that takes an immense amount of cognitive energy.
So to save battery life, your brain takes a shortcut.
It has to. It relies on the information it predicts based on whatever broad cultural categories it has available.
So we unconsciously sort the room. We create an in-group, the people whose operating systems seem to match ours, the people we can predict easily.
Right.
And we create an out-group, the people whose behavior requires too much energy to decode.
And that biological survival mechanism is the absolute bedrock of unconscious bias.
It's literally just our brains being lazy.
Basically, yeah.
Yeah.
It is the reason we fall back on stereotypes. We are not reacting to the complex human being on the screen. We are reacting to our brain's low-resolution prediction of them.
And when your prediction is wrong, the communication breakdown is instantaneous.
It happens in a split second.
And the consequences of those breakdowns, they scale up incredibly fast. When that invisible operating system crashes, it doesn't just cause a minor scheduling error.
No, the fallout is much deeper.
It causes a profound psychological fracture within the team. We see this vividly in the source material from Chris White, where he examines what actually happens when employees feel structurally misunderstood.
White's work on this is really illuminating. He opens his analysis by referencing a highly visible corporate rupture, the famous Google walkout.
Oh yeah, where 20,000 employees physically left their desks.
Exactly. They marched out of their offices to protest unequal treatment and systemic cultural failures.
It was a massive, headline-grabbing mobilization. But White pivots to a much more insidious threat, right?
He does. He points out that the employees who walked out of Google possessed a massive amount of psychological and financial leverage.
Because they were highly sought-after tech workers.
Right. They felt secure enough in their overall employability to take a public stand. But the vast majority of the global workforce does not have that luxury.
They can't afford a public protest.
Exactly. So they engage in something much quieter and arguably much more dangerous to the long-term survival of a company.
White calls them invisible walkouts or checkouts.
Invisible walkouts. It's such a chilling phrase.
It really is. When an employee's cultural operating system is constantly clashing with the dominant culture of the leadership team, and they realize their perspective is consistently misread or dismissed, they don't march in the streets.
No, they stay right there in their office chair.
They keep collecting their paycheck, but they completely withdraw their discretionary effort.
They walk out with their hearts, their hands, and their voices, but their bodies remain on the payroll.
They stop offering innovative ideas. They stop flagging potential risks.
They adopt a policy of malicious compliance, just doing exactly what they're told and not a single thing more.
And the economic devastation of this phenomenon is just staggering. White cites data showing that roughly 70% of the global workforce is actively disengaged.
70%.
That is massive. It's not just a few unhappy people complaining at the water cooler. That is a systemic failure costing the global economy hundreds of billions of dollars annually in lost productivity and stifled innovation.
There's a specific anecdote White shares that brings this data down to a painfully human level.
Oh, the one about his veteran colleague?
Yes. He was a newly minted manager, eager to make his mark, and a veteran colleague, this woman with decades of institutional knowledge, brought a complex problem to his desk.
And wanting to be collaborative, he turned the question back to her and asked for her recommendation.
He was expecting a totally routine professional exchange.
But instead, he was met with this agonizing, extended silence.
She physically froze.
Right, because she was desperately searching her brain for the correct answer that the hierarchy demanded rather than giving her actual opinion.
And finally, after a painful pause, she looked at him and admitted, "I have never been asked what I think at work before."
Decades of accumulated expertise entirely walled off. It's tragic.
It really is. And to understand why a professional would check out so thoroughly, we have to look at the psychological weight of those cultural collisions.
Right.
When a manager shuts down an employee's idea or misinterprets their communication style as aggressive or evasive, it is rarely perceived by the employee as a mere technical disagreement.
It registers in the brain as an identity threat.
Exactly. Identity threat. That is a critical distinction.
If I present a financial model and you tell me my math is wrong, that's a technical critique.
Right. That's about the numbers.
But if I present an idea using the communication style my parents taught me, the style my culture deems respectful and intelligent, and you tell me I'm communicating poorly, you're not critiquing my work.
You are critiquing the fundamental beliefs established in Kriegel's cycle.
You're attacking the map of the world they built to keep themselves safe.
Exactly. The brain processes that not as professional feedback, but as an existential threat to the self. And to protect the self from further damage, the employee permanently checks out.
This creates an immediate paradox, though.
How so?
Well, if simply misunderstanding someone's communication style or asking them to adapt to a new workflow can trigger an existential identity threat, how does a global enterprise function at all?
That is the million-dollar question.
I mean, we can't eliminate conflict. We can't just agree on every single project to avoid threatening someone's identity. If we need to hold people accountable, how do we do it without triggering an invisible walkout?
To solve that paradox, we really have to examine the mechanical differences in how various cultures process conflict and protect identity.
Okay.
Because what constitutes an identity threat is entirely dependent on whether your deeply held beliefs were formed in a high-context culture or a low-context culture.
Which brings us to Maria Pastorelli's framework, and this story she tells that perfectly encapsulates the friction of context.
Oh, the hot water story. I love this one.
It's so good. So Pastorelli is Italian. She moves to Shanghai to immerse herself in Chinese language and culture. Early in her trip, she sits down at a local restaurant, orders a plate of dumplings, and asks the waiter for a glass of water.
Now, in Europe, asking for water is a binary transaction. You want a clear liquid at room temperature or colder to quench your thirst.
Right. But the waiter returns with her dumplings and a steaming, boiling glass of hot water.
Which is not what she wanted.
At all. So Pastorelli is instantly confused. She assumes her nascent Mandarin skills are to blame.
She thinks she botched the pronunciation.
Exactly. She thinks she messed up her tonal pronunciation, and the waiter brought her tea without the leaves, or maybe soup broth. She drinks the hot water, assumes the error is hers, and doesn't complain.
But it takes her weeks to realize that her pronunciation was actually flawless.
The translation was perfect. The cultural context was entirely mismatched.
Right, because in China, serving cold water is traditionally viewed as bad for digestion. So the standard cultural default for water at a restaurant is hot water.
The literal word was identical, but the unspoken expectations surrounding the word were worlds apart.
And Pastorelli uses this hot water phenomenon to illustrate the massive divide between low context and high context communication styles.
And in the business world, this divide is the source of almost every major international identity threat.
Let's establish the parameters of low context communication first.
Okay, let's break it down.
This style is heavily dominant in the United States, Germany, the Netherlands, and much of Northern Europe. In a low context framework, communication is viewed purely as a tool for transferring information as efficiently as possible.
So the primary focus is on the task at hand.
Exactly. The dictionary definition of the word is the entire message. If I say no, I mean exactly that.
If I say, this project is failing, I am not offering a metaphor, I am delivering a status report.
Crucially, in low-context cultures, the idea is aggressively separated from the individual who proposed it.
Right, you separate the art from the artist, basically.
Yes. You can viciously debate a colleague's marketing strategy in a meeting, tear the idea to absolute shreds, and then go out for a beer with that same colleague an hour later, and no one feels personally attacked.
Because transparency, extreme directness, and explicit clarity are the highest virtues.
Now, pivot to high-context communication, which dominates much of East Asia, the Middle East, and parts of Latin America.
Okay, how does that work?
In a high-context framework, the literal words spoken are only a tiny fraction of the actual message.
So the words are almost secondary.
They really are. The true meaning is embedded in the context surrounding the words. To understand what is being said, you had to read a complex matrix of subtext.
Like, what is the power dynamic between the speakers?
Yes, what is their shared history? What is their physical posture? And most importantly, what is intentionally not being said?
It's the difference between reading a software manual and analyzing a poem.
That's a brilliant analogy.
The software manual low context puts all the meaning directly on the page. The poem high context hides the meaning in the spaces between the stanzas, in the rhythm, in the unspoken emotion.
And when you force these two frameworks into the same virtual meeting room without any preparation, you inevitably trigger what Pastorelli calls the stereotype trap.
Because the brain can't easily decode the opposing framework.
Right, so it falls back on its prediction machine and assigns malicious intent to the confusion.
So the low-context communicators, the Americans or Germans, look at their high-context colleagues and label them as passive, evasive, indecisive, or fundamentally untrustworthy because they won't just give a straight yes or no answer.
Exactly. And simultaneously, the high-context communicators look at the Americans and Germans and label them as aggressive, arrogant, profoundly disrespectful, and entirely lacking in the nuance required for complex leadership.
And both sides feel their identity is under attack.
And both sides are entirely wrong about the other's intent. They're simply executing their default software for what is considered polite.
Wow. We have spent some good time in the theoretical framework, but to truly grasp the destructive power of this dynamic, we need to examine the centerpiece of today's source stack.
The Kenji and Elena case study.
Yes, the dialogue between Kenji and Elena. This is a postmortem of a project that was technically completed, but left massive psychological wreckage in its wake.
Let's set the stage. Elena is leading a team based in Europe, operating heavily on a low-context, direct communication model.
And Kenji is managing a team of stakeholders based in Tokyo, operating in a highly refined, high-context model.
Both leaders genuinely believed they were being cooperative, yet the project was plagued by silent resentment and stalled timelines.
And the transcript reveals 4 specific friction points where their cultural icebergs collided.
The first major rupture centers on the conflict between direct transparency and the concept of face.
Right. So Elena's European team is reviewing a batch of technical documentation submitted by Kenji's Tokyo engineers during a large steering committee meeting.
A very public setting.
Yes. A European architect named Marcus reviews the files and openly states in the meeting that the Tokyo documentation is insufficient and unclear.
Now, from a low-context perspective, Marcus is doing his job perfectly.
Yeah, Elena notes in the debrief that in Germany, calling a document unclear is incredibly mild feedback.
It is purely operational. It signals that Marcus has actually read the material and is actively engaged in improving the project. He is attacking the problem, not the engineers.
But the Tokyo team does not separate the idea from the individual. Kenji explains to Elena that this single comment, insufficient and unclear, paralyzed his team.
It completely shut them down.
The comments circulated internally in Tokyo for days. Kenji explicitly states that when a manager publicly challenges a team member's work in a broad forum, the team becomes intensely cautious.
Because the risk of public failure is just too high.
They stop contributing new ideas entirely.
To understand why a mild critique caused such massive paralysis, we bring in Valerie Hook's TEDx insights regarding the concept of mianzi, which translates roughly to face or reputation.
Face. I've heard this term, but how does it actually function?
In high-context Asian cultures, face is not just about avoiding embarrassment. Face is your foundational social currency.
It's literally how you trade favors and get things done.
Exactly. It determines your credibility, your influence, and your ability to execute tasks within the group network. Face is accumulated over years of careful relationship building.
But crucially, face can be instantly destroyed.
Right. If you are criticized in a public forum, especially by a peer or a superior, you do not just feel bad, you lose your social capital.
So in Elena's mind, Marcus was pointing out a typo on a schematic. But in Kenji's reality, Marcus was publicly stripping the Tokyo team of their professional dignity.
Exactly. And Hooks provides a fascinating anecdote to illustrate how deeply ingrained the protection of face really is.
Oh, the story about the Dutch client.
Yes, she details a business arrangement involving a Dutch client and a local Chinese partner she calls Mr. Fan.
Right, they had successfully negotiated a contract, the Dutch client flew back to Europe, and suddenly a crucial local investor pulled out.
The deal was in massive jeopardy.
Now, a low-context manager would immediately call the Dutch client, explain the problem transparently, and try to brainstorm a solution.
But Mr. Fan did not call the Dutch client.
Because that would be losing face.
Exactly. He went to Hooks and her local team instead, asking them to quietly intervene. Hooks explains that if Mr. Fan had gone directly to the client with the failure, the client would have been upset, and Mr. Fan would have lost face.
And that loss of face would have permanently damaged the trust required for the long-term partnership.
Right. So by utilizing a third party to navigate the crisis, the deal was eventually saved, and Mr. Fan's social currency remained intact.
The priority was preserving the relationship matrix, not achieving immediate transparent efficiency.
Which Elena had absolutely no understanding of.
None at all. Which leads us directly to the second major friction point in their project, the sound of silence.
The silence issue is huge in these cross-cultural meetings.
It is. The transcript shows Elena expressing deep frustration with the rhythm of their virtual meetings. She would present a new strategic idea, ask the Tokyo team for their thoughts, and be met with total silence.
Because in Elena's low-context operating system, silence is an alarm bell.
Right. It means the team is confused, completely unprepared, or silently hostile to the idea. So her reaction was to immediately start talking again.
Re-explaining the concept or demanding a response, just to fill the void.
I view Elena's approach like a live tennis match. She is standing at the baseline, smashing a heavy forehand over the net. If Kenji doesn't immediately swing his racket and hit the ball back, Elena assumes he has forfeited the point.
So she serves another ball.
Exactly. But Kenji isn't playing tennis. He is playing correspondence chess.
I love that analogy.
When Elena hits the ball over the net, Kenji's team isn't ignoring her. They are looking at the entire board, calculating the implications of her idea 5 moves deep.
Because Kenji explains that in his culture, responding instantly with an unformed opinion is considered reckless.
Silence is actually a demonstration of respect.
Right. It proves you are giving the idea the careful consideration it deserves.
And while Kenji's team is engaged in this deep, respectful calculation, Elena is relentlessly firing more tennis balls at them.
The cognitive load on the Tokyo team is immense.
They are translating technical English, trying to decode the subtext of Elena's impatience, and trying to formulate a respectful, harmonious response, all while she continues to talk over them.
This exhausting dynamic sets the stage for the third and perhaps most critical friction point, the battle between live debate and Imawashi.
Okay, let's get into this, because Elena's team valued speed and decisiveness above almost everything else.
They want it solved right now.
Right. Their ideal meeting structure was simple. Identify a problem, engage in a vigorous live debate in front of everyone, reach a conclusion, and walk out of the room with an actionable decision.
They viewed meetings as the arena for conflict resolution.
But Elena noticed a baffling pattern. Her team would secure what they thought was an agreement, only for the Tokyo team to quietly reopen the same issue a week later via email.
Which made the Europeans view the Japanese engineers as indecisive or purposely obstructionist.
Kenji finally diagnoses the problem by introducing Elena to the concept of nimawashi.
Nimawashi is such a crucial concept. It's the highly structured practice of informal, behind-the-scenes consensus building.
Because in a high-context culture, you do not throw raw, unvetted ideas into a public arena for a bloodbath debate.
Never. Long before the formal meeting is even scheduled, leaders will quietly float ideas to key stakeholders in private, one-on-one conversations.
They gauge reactions, absorb objections, and adjust the proposal.
Right, so by the time everyone actually sits down at the conference table, all the conflict has already been resolved in the shadows.
The formal meeting is not a debate. It is a ceremonial ratification of a decision that was already made.
Exactly. To Kenji's team, Elena's habit of forcing junior engineers to debate senior leadership live on a Zoom call felt like absolute chaos.
And this aversion to public conflict is rooted in the profound drive for harmony, or HEI, which Hoax explores in her source material.
Yes, hey, in highly interdependent, high-context cultures, maintaining the relational equilibrium of the group is paramount.
You do not assert your individual ego forcefully. You wait for the appropriate moment to align with the group.
This leads to an exchange in the transcript that is truly staggering for a Western manager to read.
About the technical error.
Yes. Elena points out that junior members of the Tokyo team never corrected senior leadership, even when Elena knew the junior engineer possessed the correct technical data.
She could not fathom why they would let a technical error stand.
And Kenji's response dismantles Elena's entire worldview. He tells her, correctness is not always the only consideration.
When I read that, my mind was blown. If the math is wrong, how can correctness not be the only consideration? If they build a bridge with bad math, the bridge collapses.
Right.
How can harmony matter more than structural integrity?
Because you are viewing the problem through a short-term transactional lens. Kenji is viewing it through a long-term systemic lens.
Okay, unpack that for me.
If a junior engineer publicly humiliates a senior manager by correcting them in front of European partners, the manager loses face, the hierarchy is shattered, and the trust within the team is permanently destroyed. Yes, the junior engineer might win a single technical argument, but they have guaranteed that the team will never function cohesively again. Kenji's system prioritizes the survival of the team over the immediate victory of the individual.
That profound disconnect leads to the final fatal friction point, the illusions of yes and no.
This happens all the time.
Because Elena was forcing a low-context live debate onto a high-context team, the feedback she received was completely scrambled.
Elena recounts a pivotal meeting where she presented a massive shift in project scope. She looked around the virtual room, everyone nodded, and nobody raised an explicit objection.
So she logged off believing she had a mandate to proceed.
Of course.
2 days later, Kenji sends an email outlining a massive list of critical concerns from his stakeholders. Elena felt entirely betrayed.
But Kenji pulls the transcript of the meeting and points out that his team did express their objections.
They used phrases like, "We may need additional internal reflection on this timeline," Or there are a few sensitivities regarding this resource allocation.
But in Elena's low-context operating system, if a timeline is impossible, you say, the timeline is impossible.
Right, so when she heard additional internal reflection, she literally thought it meant they just needed an hour to review a spreadsheet.
She completely missed the blaring alarm bells hidden in the subtext.
Yeah, and Kenji diagnoses this perfectly. He warns Elena that their mutual fluency in English created a dangerous false sense of alignment.
They were sharing the exact same vocabulary, but translating it through entirely different cultural algorithms.
When you look at the entirety of their dialogue, you realize that neither Elena nor Kenji was malicious, and neither was inherently wrong.
No, not at all. The failure was entirely structural. They lacked what Kenji brilliantly terms communication governance.
Communication governance. Because they had incredibly detailed governance for how to deploy code, how to manage the budget, how to track milestones.
But they spent 0 hours defining how they would actually speak to one another.
They never established whether silence meant agreement or disagreement.
And because they lacked a shared framework, everyone retreated to their default cultural software, resulting in a mutual cognitive overload that almost destroyed the project.
Wow. So once an organization recognizes that this mutual cognitive overload is bleeding their productivity, the immediate question becomes, how do we fix our hiring and team building to prevent this?
And this requires a massive strategic pivot away from traditional corporate doctrine.
Specifically, we have to throw one of the most beloved corporate buzzwords into the garbage. We have to dismantle the myth of culture fit.
Oh, culture fit. Jessica Kriegel and the organizational psychologists said, indeed, tear this concept apart.
Because for decades, hiring managers have been instructed to look for candidates who seamlessly blend into the existing company culture.
The logic was that if everyone shares the same vibe and the same communication style, you eliminate friction and increase speed.
But Kriegel points out that when a manager looks for a culture fit, what their brain's prediction machine is actually doing is looking for a mirror.
Exactly. The manager is unconsciously seeking a candidate who looks, speaks, and processes conflict exactly the way they do.
It is institutionalized unconscious bias.
It really is. If a company operates on a hyper-aggressive, low-context model and they only hire culture fits, they will organically filter out anyone who practices nemawashi or prioritizes consensus building.
They end up with an echo chamber that feels incredibly efficient, right up until a complex global challenge shatters their rigid worldview.
So the necessary paradigm shift is moving from culture fit to hiring for enculturability.
Which some progressive HR departments are starting to call culture ad, right?
Yes. Enculturability is a metric of psychological flexibility. It measures an individual's capacity to consciously identify the dominant communication framework of a new environment, adapt their own style to function within it, while still retaining the courage to inject their unique, diverse perspective into the system to improve it.
So an employee with high enculturability can walk into Elena's chaotic live debate, recognize that nemawashi won't work in this specific room, adapt to the directness, but still utilize their deep understanding of group harmony to ensure no one loses face during the argument.
They flex without breaking.
Flex without breaking, I love that. But for an organization to benefit from enculturability, they must actively design an environment where employees feel safe enough to bring what Chris White calls their whole selves to work.
Because if you demand that a diverse hire assimilate completely into the dominant culture, you destroy the exact unique perspective you paid to acquire.
White shares a fantastic story that makes the return on investment for this concept undeniably clear. He introduces us to Joan Bohan, who served as a finance director at Disney Europe.
By all traditional metrics, Joan was a highly effective executive.
But Joan was also the mother of a son with severe dyslexia. She had spent years intimately understanding the visual struggles associated with the condition.
Now, in a rigid culture-fit environment, Joan would never mention her son's dyslexia at the office.
Right, she would compartmentalize her identity, leaving the mother at home and bringing only the finance director to the boardroom.
But Disney had cultivated an environment that rewarded employees for bringing their whole authentic experiences to the table.
So when Disney launched an internal corporate contest seeking innovative ideas to improve the business, Joan didn't pitch a new accounting software.
She utilized her deeply personal experience.
She knew that specific typographic modifications, adjusting the weight of the letters, widening the spacing made text significantly easier for dyslexic individuals to process.
So she pitched the development of specialized dyslexia-friendly fonts.
And Disney recognized the brilliance of the idea, developed the typography, and fundamentally improved the user experience for millions of consumers globally.
That innovation, a massive win for the company's brand and consumer reach, did not come from a focus group.
It came from a finance director who felt psychologically safe enough to let the submerged portion of her iceberg breach the surface.
If she had been forced to act as a standard corporate drone, that idea would have remained hidden forever.
Which brings us to the ultimate pragmatic question. We understand the theoretical danger of the iceberg. We know that hiring for enculturability is the goal.
But what does this actually look like in practice?
Right. How do you unblock a team that is currently paralyzed by high and low context collisions?
Well, for mechanical breakdown, we turn to Torsten M. Kuhlmann and Ramona Heinz, who outlined a rigorous 6-step process for managing cultural diversity.
And it is critical to note that this is not a 45-minute lunch and learn seminar. This is a multi-quarter systemic overhaul.
Exactly. So instead of just listing the steps, let's apply them directly to the wreckage of Elena and Kenji's project.
Okay, let's do it.
Step 1 is to define objectives. Elena and Kenji cannot just say, we need to communicate better.
Too vague.
Their objective must be highly specific. We need to design a communication governance document that outlines exactly how we flag critical risks without causing a loss of face.
Step 2 is to specify responsibilities. They cannot just outsource this to HR. Elena, as the European lead, and Kenji, as the Tokyo lead, must be personally accountable for enforcing the new governance.
Step 3 is where the real work happens. Analyze the current situation. This requires radical honesty.
Elena has to map out exactly how her live debates are shutting down the Tokyo engineers.
And Kenji has to map out how the delayed Nimawashi process is bottlenecking Elena's timeline.
Once the diagnosis is clear, step 4 is to develop a strategy to bridge the gap.
Perhaps they compromise. Elena agrees to send all major proposals 3 days in advance to allow for quiet consensus building.
And Kenji agrees that during the formal meeting, his team will use a specific, explicit phrase like red flag instead of relying on the phrase additional internal reflection.
Perfect. Step 5 is to implement the strategy with total transparency across both teams.
And step 6 is to periodically evaluate the new process. If a junior engineer speaks up and the system breaks down again, they review the governance and adjust.
But Kuhlmann and Heinz make it clear that none of those 6 steps will work if the foundation is rotten.
And that foundation is psychological safety.
Exactly.
The analytics team at WorkHuman cites a massive multi-year study conducted by Google to determine the single most important factor in a high-performing team.
It wasn't the pedigree of the engineers.
And it wasn't the budget. It was unequivocally psychological safety.
Because if team members fear that making a mistake or speaking with an accent will trigger an identity threat or a loss of social currency, the 6 steps will fail.
Building that safety requires aggressive structural intervention. It requires funding employee resource groups to build internal communities.
It requires ensuring diverse representation at the executive level so junior employees see a path upward.
It also requires continuous, rigorous, unconscious bias training. We all possess those cognitive prediction machines. We all rely on stereotypes to save mental energy.
Training is about teaching leaders to catch their brain in the act of making a lazy assumption, pausing, and choosing to investigate the complex human reality instead.
Oh, and as a quick, slightly painful aside from the WorkHuman materials, if you are trying to demonstrate cultural inclusion in the office, doing a fake, exaggerated Irish accent on St. Patrick's Day is not the way to do it.
Just don't do it.
Keep the focus on deep-level inclusion, not surface-level caricatures.
A very fair point. But we must also address the reality that even with flawless psychological safety, profound enculturability, and perfect communication governance, diverse teams are still going to fundamentally disagree.
Because diversity guarantees friction.
Right. So how do you prevent a disagreement from stalling a project indefinitely?
Well, Chris White offers a highly tactical solution used by Jeff Bezos at Amazon known as disagree and commit.
It is a phenomenal mechanism for bypassing endless consensus loops.
If an organization has built a deep enough reservoir of trust, you do not have to force a fake, harmonious agreement.
A leader can address the friction explicitly. They can look at a dissenting team and say, I know we look at this data differently, and I know you do not agree with this strategic direction, but will you gamble with me on it?
Will you gamble with me? It's brilliant because it validates the opposing perspective. It doesn't tell the dissenting team that their cultural operating system is wrong or that their math is flawed.
It simply asks for a behavioral commitment to move forward together, despite the differing beliefs. It provides an off-ramp that preserves everyone's face.
And if you want to know if your specific team has built enough trust to execute a maneuver like disagree and commit, Chris White provides a highly revealing diagnostic tool.
I think everyone should do this.
This is the Monday morning test, and I am issuing this challenge directly to you. This coming Monday morning, I want you to walk the floor of your office or ping people individually on your Slack channels.
Ask 10 different people below you, above you, and lateral to you, this exact question.
What don't we talk about around here that we really should be talking about?
The literal answer they give you is far less important than the speed and tone of their reaction.
If you ask that question and you are met with an agonizing silence or nervous laughter or people quickly changing the subject, you have a massive problem.
Your organization is blocked, the invisible walkout is already happening.
But asking the question is the first swing of the hammer to break the ice. You are signaling that the environment is finally safe enough to surface the submerged issues.
As White says, drawing on the philosophy of Ari Weinsweg, the goal of leadership is not to have no problems. The goal is to have better problems.
A team that is passionately, loudly arguing over how to scale a brilliant new technical innovation is experiencing a problem.
A team that sits in absolute silence while a project fails because they are too terrified of an identity threat to speak up is also experiencing a problem.
One of those problems leads to market dominance. The other leads to bankruptcy.
So true.
Let's pull the threads of this deep dive together. We have journeyed far past the superficial advice on business card etiquette.
We dove into the submerged 90% of the cultural iceberg, mapping how the rules of our childhood dinner tables become the invisible operating systems of our boardrooms.
We analyzed the devastating economic toll of the invisible walkout and the reality of identity threats.
We dissected the exhausting cognitive load of translating between high-context harmony and low-context transparency.
We watched Kenji and Elena nearly destroy a project because they mistook English fluency for cultural alignment.
And we explored the strategic imperative of abandoning the bias of culture fit in order to cultivate true psychological enculturability.
It is a profound shift in how we perceive the colleagues on our screens. We must transition from relying on our brain's lazy predictions to engaging with genuine, active curiosity.
Absolutely.
And as we conclude, we want to leave you with a final thought to mull over before your next global sync.
Corporate leadership spends an inordinate amount of time and capital trying to eliminate the friction of cultural differences. We draft policies and enforce frameworks designed to make everyone align, to make the machine run smoothly and quietly.
But what if that friction is not a bug in the system?
Exactly. What if the heat generated by the collision of a high-context perspective and a low-context perspective is the exact spark required to forge an innovative idea your competitors could never dream of?
The question is not how you erase the differences in your team.
The question is, do you possess the enculturability required to harness the heat they create?
Because if your only goal is to eliminate the friction, you will inevitably end up sitting in a completely silent, perfectly harmonious room, wondering why your best talent just quietly walked out the door.
Embrace the heat.
Seek out the better problems.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Go ask those 10 people your Monday morning question, and we'll see you next time.